British aid in March-November I-3 came to a staggering £11 million, a figure equal to the total cost of all loans and subsidies during the wars of 1793 to 108. This was excluding a further PSC million of arms and equipment provided during I-3 and other large sums paid to Denmark, Holland and Hanover. The conference achieved nothing. Napoleon made it clear that he would concede on Illyria but not on Italy, the Grand Duchy of Warsaw or the Confederation of the Rhine. Metternich replied that in that case there was nothing to talk about. Angrily Napoleon flashed at him, "Ah, you persist, you still want to dictate to me. All right then, war. But, au revoir, in Vienna." Metternich shrugged. As he was leaving the conference chamber, Berthier took him aside and asked if things had gone satisfactorily. Metternich replied, "Yes, he has made everything abundantly clear. It's all up with him." Next day Austria signed the secret Accord of Reichenbach with Prussia and Russia, agreeing to enter the war on their side if France would not accept Metternich's terms. Immediately after the Dresden Conference, Napoleon had second thoughts, felt he had mishandled matters and arranged a further peace congress in Prague. The armistice was extended until August. But in the immediate aftermath of Dresden there came news also of the sudden collapse of the French position in Spain. One immediate result of the Rate R2 debacle was that Britain sent reinforcements to Spain. By the beginning of Rate R3, Wellington, recognized as Commander-in-Chief, Spain, by the Supreme Junta in November, Rate RZ, commanded 87,000 troops and the number would top R0 by the spring. So far from reinforcing his armies in Spain, Napoleon was forced to recall RS0 of them to serve in the Rate R3 campaign in Germany. Sheer numbers now told against Joseph. With the increasing strength of the guerrillas, it took 4 divisions to keep open the route between Madrid and the Pyrenees and 6 weeks for a dispatch from Madrid to reach Paris. When Soult, to Joseph's relief, was recalled and replaced with Marshal Jourdan, Joseph's old friend, the two men took counsel on what they could achieve with their exiguous numbers. Jourdan advised that the south and northwest of Spain must be abandoned in favor of concentration in the key areas of Old Castile, Navarre, the Pyrenean routes, Santander and San Sebastian. Napoleon concurred and in March Rate R3 ordered Joseph to abandon Madrid and move his capital to Valladolid. Joseph had long been preparing for Wellington's annual invasion of Spain but was sadly short of troops. Originally he had planned to deploy his forces in a great semicircle stretching from Leon, west of Burgos, to La Mancha, south of Madrid, but his brother's orders, finally realistic, at least enabled him to fight a defensive campaign. But he could neither persuade his brother the emperor that Wellington outnumbered him, nor summon aid from Suchet, who had his hands full in Catalonia, and Aragon with invaders from Sicily. Working with Jourdan, Joseph decided that Wellington would enter Spain via Ciudad Rodrigo and head northeast through Salamanca and Valladolid. As expected, Wellington advanced on Salamanca in May, concentrating his forces to meet him. Joseph discovered to his alarm that it was not the full R0 strong Allied force that had occupied the city but a much smaller force. Wellington had duped him by sending his main army under General Sir Thomas Graham to cross into Spain further north. Graham's 6 divisions emerged onto the plains of Leon from the Traz-os Montes mountains, where Wellington's decoy force from Salamanca joined them after forced marches. After concentrating at Toro, Wellington turned Marmont's old tactics back on the French by hooking ever north, threatening to get round the enemy and forcing the evacuation of Palencia and Burgos. Continually outflanked, Joseph pulled his forces back to the plain west of Vitoria. Wellington realized that a victory here would not deliver the ultimate strategic objective of clearing the French out of Spain, and that ideally he needed a battle farther west, but he had problems himself with long supply lines. Although he was being partially provisioned by Royal Navy vessels at Corunna, the main supply line ran back to Portugal, a 10-week journey away, and for 5 days he had had to live off the land. The decisive clash came on the 19th of June. Joseph was expecting a frontal attack from the west, but Wellington planned a 2-pronged onslaught from the north. He observed that Joseph had made a bad error by drawing up his forces with a 5-mile gap between the front-line army of the south and the second-line army of Portugal. To lull the French, Wellington sent General Hill through the pass of La Puebla onto the Vitoria plain, as Joseph had expected. Then he unleashed his main attack. Caught between 2 fires, the French attempted a fighting withdrawal, which quickly became a rout as they discovered, too late, that the British had come down behind them to seize the roads to Bayonne and Bilbao. Reduced to withdrawing along the rough track to Pamplona, the French army soon dissolved into a chaos of panicked men, frightened camp followers and abandoned wagons. Vitoria was a spectacular victory, as it severed the French retreat to San Sebastian and Bayonne, and made the French abandon all their artillery, stores, ammunition and equipment, including paintings, money and other treasures evacuated from Madrid. The entire payroll of the French army was also captured, with the result that millions of gold francs disappeared into the pockets of British, Spanish, and Portuguese soldiers. Joseph's army took 8,000 casualties and lost several hundreds more to guerrillas during the retreat. It was fortunate for the French that torrential rain and the state of the road led Wellington to call off the pursuit up the Pamplona track after 5 miles. The panic-stricken French did not halt their flight until the Pyrenean border, and Joseph retired in disgrace to Paris. Wellington was now the cynosure of Europe. He received his field marshal baton, and Beethoven composed Wellington's victory in his honor. But he was frustrated at not being able to press on into Aragon and Catalonia to deal with Suchet and Clausel. In a word, the discipline of his troops broke down completely. It was their crazed looting after Vittoria that drew from their commander the celebrated remark that his men were the scum of the earth. If Joseph had been able to regroup and counterattack, he would have found the entire British army roaring drunk. By the time Wellington had restored order with the gallows and the lash, Clausel had retreated into France, leaving only Pamplona and San Sebastian in French hands. News of Vittoria reached Dresden on July and simply hardened Austrian resolve to join the Allies. Even if Austria, Prussia, and Russia had been willing to come to terms with Napoleon, this was not really an option now, for the British called in the quid pro quo for their subsidies, insisting that the Allies remain in the field lest Napoleon turn his full power against Wellington in Spain. Napoleon sent an unwilling Soult from Dresden to Bayonne to form a new army from the escapees of Vittoria, and gave him a warrant for Joseph's arrest. For once Soult bestirred himself, retrained the scattered remnants of the former French armies in Spain, and recrossed the border into the peninsula with a force of 80,000, hoping to relieve Pamplona. Soult contrived to delay Wellington's invasion of France for 4 months by launching a two-pronged attack on the besiegers of Pamplona. Defeated twice by Wellington and with dwindling food supplies, he managed to delay the fall of Pamplona and San Sebastian before withdrawing into France. He had done enough to escape the worst rages of the emperor. The cautious Wellington was not the man to invade France with San Sebastian and Pamplona still untaken in his rear. In any case, England's military hero had his own problems, for the United States was at war with Britain, and American warships and privateers made serious inroads on British shipping in the Bay of Biscay. And when San Sebastian did finally fall, on 3 August, there was the almost predictable orgy of rape, murder, and pillage from the scum of the earth. In Dresden, Napoleon awaited the results of the Prague Conference, where Caulaincourt was his envoy. Historians divide on Napoleon's intentions at this time. Some claim that he genuinely wanted peace, foreseeing the outcome if he had to fight all 3 great European powers, but that he was overwhelmed by the sheer malice of his enemies, who never had any intention of offering him reasonable terms. Others claim that he was merely stalling for time, waiting until the harvest was in, hoping the Allies would have second thoughts once they realized France was not on its knees, but determined to fight to the end if that was necessary. Ever the opportunist, Napoleon was clearly hoping for something to turn up, but he refused to make the one concession that might have split the Allies, relinquishing the Confederation of the Rhine. This was the item that particularly exercised Prussia and Austria, who were fearful long-term of a permanent Russian presence in Western Europe. Caulaincourt pleaded with him to bend on this point, but had to endure irate outbursts and slammed doors for his pains. At Prague, Caulaincourt went well beyond his instructions in an attempt to secure an accord with Metternich. Some French historians have even accused him of treason, but his action was surely simply the despair reasonable Frenchmen felt about the everlasting conflict with which their emperor had landed them. Metternich unhelpfully repeated that Austria was committed to go to war on the side of the Allies if there was no agreement by the 10th of August. When Caulaincourt reported this to Napoleon, he once again stalled and disingenuously tried the ploy known to every roguish solicitor. He asked for further and better particulars. Metternich, tired of French procrastination and convinced there could never be an agreement, opted for a propaganda advantage by offering surprisingly mild terms. Nothing was said about Italy, but Prussia would have to be restored as far as the Elbe and the Duchy of Warsaw broken up, although Hamburg, Trieste, and Lübeck were declared non-negotiable. The return of the western portions of Prussia, lost to the Kingdom of Westphalia in 1806-7, were not demanded back, but Metternich was adamant that the Confederation of the Rhine would have to be dissolved. Caulaincourt begged Napoleon to accept these terms, but the emperor argued that the buffer states of the Confederation of the Rhine were the only way France could safeguard its natural frontier on the Rhine. Although the new conditions seemed more lenient than those offered at Dresden on the 26th of June, when their implications were teased out, it seemed that France was being asked to return, not just to 1796, but to 1792, before the decree of the Convention laid down the natural frontiers as an integral part of French sovereignty. Napoleon once again insinuated the idea that he was a mere plaything of history, a slave of destiny, not the purposive conqueror of the ogre myth. In reply to Metternich's ultimatum, he asked for compensation in the form of Austrian and Prussian territory for the King of Saxony, the partition of the Duchy of Warsaw, and for Hamburg and Trieste. He told Caulaincourt he had to insist on this for, if he acquiesced in Metternich's terms, it would simply encourage the Allies to demand even more. The deeply disillusioned Caulaincourt commented, "The cause of our disappointments is in the refusal to make timely concessions, and it will end by ruining us completely." On August, true to her word, Austria declared war on France. The previous month Sweden, under Bernadotte, had joined in, animated by his hatred for Bonaparte. The Tsar had made strenuous efforts to get him on the Allied side and, in an ironic gloss on Ronde d'Amour, even offered him as bride the very sister he had refused Napoleon, provided, of course, Bernadotte got rid of Désirée. The Allies could draw on enormous forces. Apart from Sweden's 40,000, Prussia was contributing 60,000, Russia 84,000 and Austria 27,000. 500,000 men were ready to march and there was an estimated 350,000 more in the recruitment pipeline. There would be 4 separate Allied forces, the II-00 Army of the North under Bernadotte, based on Berlin, the 95,000-strong Army of Silesia under Blücher at Breslau, the Russian so-called Army of Poland with a new commander, Bennigsen, the veteran of Eylau, and the main striking force, the 230,000-strong Army of Bohemia based on the Upper Elbe, under the command of the Austrian Schwarzenberg. Tsar Alexander insisted that the Austrian be the Allied commander-in-chief, in preference to the more obvious choice, Blücher. He thought he could dominate the Austrian but knew that the fiery Prussian would simply ignore him. The 3 allies, wary of taking on Bonaparte at anything like equal odds, had agreed on a Fabian strategy of attrition. If Napoleon threatened any of their armies, it was to retreat while the others maneuvered to cut his communications. Relying on favorable elements of space and time, they would gradually wear the French down by avoiding battle with the Emperor while defeating his marshals. On paper, Napoleon could oppose these 800,000 allies with 680,000 of his own, raised by titanic efforts. Most of these were raw and ill-trained recruits, but % were French and the officer problem was easing, though the shortage of horses always remained his Achilles heel. His strategy for the renewed campaign was to await the enemy at Dresden with his main force of 250,000 and 7 corps, while 20,000 men and 4 infantry corps under Oudinot would advance on Berlin to deal with Bernadotte, and the Army of the North, Devout's 13 Corps would defend Hamburg and the lower Elbe. Dispersing his corps like this seemed an obvious mistake, not only because it vitiated the doctrine of concentration of force, but because it meant the emperor would have to rely on the independent judgment of marshals, used simply to executing part of his grand battlefield conception. Moreover, it played right into the hands of the Allied strategy of attrition. It is hard to understand what lay behind this decision. The best guess is that he wanted to disguise his essential weakness from the Allies, since even if he won at Dresden he lacked the strength to follow them into Poland. A northern campaign would show evidence of the advance he would need to claim in his bulletins. Even the marshals protested at the decision. Marmont said gloomily, "I greatly fear that on the day we gain a great victory, the emperor may learn he has lost too." If the early months of the 1813 campaign had seen Napoleon back to something like his best military form, the late summer and autumn found him back in his vacillating 1812 mood. From 17 to the 1st of August he dithered unconscionably. He advanced to Bautzen, learned the Russians intended to reinforce Blücher and decided to strike him before they could do so. Then he decided instead to intercept the 40,000 Russians. Next he changed his mind again and decided to assault Blücher at Breslau, only to find the Prussian withdrawing before him, in accordance with the Allied plan. While Napoleon was trying to pin Blücher down, Schwarzenberg advanced from Prague to threaten Dresden. It now seemed possible to strike Schwarzenberg's army of Bohemia on a vulnerable flank, so Napoleon ordered Marshal Gouvion St-Cyr to hold out in Dresden while he got into position. But word came back that Dresden could no longer hold out. This put the emperor in a dilemma. He hated to give up his idea for a flank attack but on the other hand could not afford to lose Dresden with its mass supplies of artillery, its ammunition dumps and food supplies. In an unsatisfactory compromise Napoleon divided his forces and took most of them back to Dresden, leaving just a single corps under Vandamme to harry Schwarzenberg's flank. Some military historians have claimed that if the decision had been reversed, Napoleon would have won the victory he sought. The new French army bore itself in the great traditions of the Grand Army by an astonishing 90-mile forced march in 72 hours. They arrived at Dresden on the 26th of August just in time to repel Wittgenstein's Russians, who had already reached the suburbs. Napoleon expressed contempt for his marshals, railing that he could not be everywhere at once. But his fury was matched by that of the Tsar, who saw the prize snatched from him. Nonetheless, Alexander was prepared to make the most of it and break off the action, in accordance with the general policy. It was the other 2 emperors who insisted on a battle then and there. All afternoon of the 26th of August the Allies tried to blast their way into Dresden, but the French held firm. At 5:30 Napoleon launched a counterattack, and regained all the ground lost during the day. That night he brought up reinforcements. Both sides planned to go over onto the attack on the morrow. The Allies intended a mass assault in the center, leaving the flanks weak, but it was there that Napoleon hoped for a double envelopment, using Victor on the left and the Young Guard on the right. He was confident that his center, fortified by trenches and redoubts full of cannon, was impregnable. Fierce fighting went on all day on the 27th. Although the Allied wing resisted strenuously, the French flank attack succeeded. The problems came in the center where the French were hard put to it to hold their own. Napoleon expected a decisive third day of fighting, but the Allies had taken such a mauling that they had lost heart. In a dramatic role reversal, the previously circumspect Tsar found himself vainly arguing at a council of war for perseverance, but the unexpectedly unpliant Austrians overruled him. By dawn on the 28th, the French were left in possession of the field and Napoleon could claim yet another points victory which essentially solved nothing. Moreover, the emperor's health was again giving cause for concern. At the height of the fighting on the 27th, drenched with rain and shivering with fever, he had to return to the town and lie down. Conspiracy theorists believe that an attempt was made to poison the emperor at this time, and some claim he was absent from the field at the precise time when his presence could have ensured a knockout victory. Any momentary euphoria was soon dissolved by bad news from all the other fronts. Oudinot had been defeated at Grossbrunn on the road to Berlin and MacDonald had lost 5,000 men and 100 guns in a defeat by Blücher at Katzbach. Vandamme and Eicor, harrying Schwarzenberg, were heavily defeated at Toplitz by the Russians and Prussians under Ostermann and Kleist. This was sheer bad luck. The enemy suddenly turned at bay to face Eicor and, just as Vandamme engaged them, another enemy column which had lost its way suddenly blundered into his rear. With 3,000 casualties, Eicor was all but wiped out. This showed that the Allies' strategy was correct and that Marmont had been a true prophet. Napoleon should never have split his forces and never have entrusted these delicate operations to his lesser marshals. After Dresden, Napoleon had two choices: march on Prague or Berlin. He opted for the Prussian capital but was unable to progress towards his objective because of constant Allied probes towards Dresden. First, Blücher again threatened it. Then he withdrew when he heard Bonaparte was still in charge. Next, Schwarzenberg moved forward, only to retreat likewise when Napoleon appeared. While all this went on, there came news of Ney's defeat by Bülow and Bernadotte at Dennewitz. Napoleon had foolishly put Ney in over Oudinot, and Oudinot, piqued and far the superior general, at once realized Ney's tactics were misguided. He therefore followed them to the letter, allowing Ney to discredit himself. Ney, who rushed into the thick of the battle when he should have been commanding from a hilltop, was not the only buffoon at Dennewitz that day. The absurd Bernadotte managed to arrive on the field of battle when the fighting was almost over. He then ordered Bülow to pull back and let him take over. The Prussians were infuriated at this arrogance. The people who had fought all day were to be forgotten, while a Gascon popinjay with an army that had not fought at all coolly claimed the victory. Napoleon could have told the Allies what to expect from Bernadotte, had he space to consider the multitudinous nonsense emanating from the new King of Sweden. But he had more serious matters on his mind. When news of the defeat came in, the emperor's public sang-froid was notable. He listened to the bulletin with all the coolness he could have brought to a discussion of events in China, as he himself boasted. But secretly he fumed against the fool he had made Prince of the Muscova. The game of avoid Bonaparte continued, with Bernadotte, Schwarzenberg and Blücher keeping up the pressure. As soon as Napoleon moved east from Dresden to deal with Blücher, the other two would close in and force him back. The emperor was permanently off balance, forever rushing from one front to another to make good the errors of his generals. The Allied policy of avoiding him and picking off the marshals was proving a spectacular success. Already angry about this, Napoleon threw one of his pyrotechnical displays of rage when he learned by chance that Bernadotte had been corresponding with Murat, Berthier, Oudinot and MacDonald, trying to suborn them. He denounced Murat as a traitor and feelings ran so high that Murat was seen to grasp the hilt of his saber. When Berthier tried to pour oil on troubled waters by speaking of his duty as a French prince to explore all possible avenues for peace, Napoleon rounded savagely on him. "You, too, old imbecile, what are you meddling in? Be quiet." The stress was showing. Since mid-August the emperor had lost 150,000 men and 300 cannon, and there were a further S00 on the sick list. Food supplies were running out, and the whole of Germany except for Saxony had gone over to the enemy. To husband his resources, Napoleon decided to shorten his front, and was contemplating breaking off all contact with the enemy when they changed tactics. Leaving Dresden alone, they decided to concentrate at Leipzig to cut French lines to the Rhine. Napoleon moved swiftly to take up his favorite center position around Leipzig, enabling him to move either against the combined forces of Blücher and Bernadotte or Schwarzenberg and Bennigsen. But he made the bad error of leaving St. Cyr in Dresden with a large garrison, again offending against the principle of concentration of force. Hanging on to Dresden at this stage in the campaign made no sense militarily, though possibly politically, as it was the capital of Saxony, his one remaining ally. But the time for caution was long gone. The emperor needed to assemble every available man for one last battle. The game of military tag went on for 3 weeks, with Bernadotte, Blücher, MacDonald and Napoleon all chasing each other at various times. The French army wore itself out with marching and countermarching while achieving nothing. Napoleon's dilemma was that if he pursued Blücher and Bernadotte too far, he would leave Leipzig unguarded. At the same time, because the Allies always avoided battle with him, he could spend forever probing out of Leipzig without making contact. His one chance came on the 5th of October when Blücher and Bernadotte linked up. The Swedish monarch favored withdrawal over the Elbe, but Blücher was adamant that they must join Schwarzenberg and the Army of Bohemia. The three armies therefore finally converged on Leipzig. Based at Dubin from 10 the 14th of October, Napoleon was once again sunk in the deepest gloom. Fane reported that he would sit at his desk with an abstracted expression, doodling on a piece of paper. The French now faced the obvious danger of being trapped between three armies instead of being able to defeat the enemy piecemeal. Napoleon finally ordered a general concentration of his forces at Leipzig, but still kept a substantial garrison in Dresden. Once again it was the hard-driving Blücher who ultimately persuaded the Allies to take on Bonaparte in a final battle. Both Bernadotte and Schwarzenberg were highly dubious, so it was that when 60,000 French troops faced twice that number of Allies in a titanic 3-day struggle that ever afterwards bore the title the Battle of the Nations. The geography of Leipzig determined the course of the battle. Napoleon had the advantage of interior lines to offset his numerical disparity, since he could fight with Leipzig at his back while the Allies had to enter combat on a wider front. 4 rivers meet at Leipzig, and in 1813 they divided the environs into the 4 points of the compass. Having destroyed most of the bridges, Napoleon could feel confident that the main fighting would take place to the east of the city, where a series of undulating ridges, harboring many villages and hamlets, protected an otherwise flat plain. The terrain therefore uniquely combined strong defensive positions with a battleground where cavalry could be used. It seemed unlikely that the Allies could work their way round to the marshy south, so their only other option was to probe around the west or possibly try to break in via the flat and open north. Napoleon's idea was to fight a holding action in the north, using 3 IV, VI and 7 Corps, while the garrison troops of Leipzig secured the western routes to Lindenau. The decisive action would be in the east, with 2 V, 8 and XI Corps. IX Corps and the Guard would be in reserve. The Allies initially planned to loop round through the marshes to the south but were intercepted by the French, so that the main battle took place in the southeast. Napoleon did not expect much fighting in the north and west, so was caught off balance when it happened. His inadequate preparations to deal with this contingency can be realized from 2 salient facts. He was utterly complacent about the west and had built no additional bridges across the river from Leipzig to Lindenau, and he was so confident that fighting in the north would be sporadic that he weakened the sector by withdrawing part of Marmont's VI Corps to the south. When contact with the enemy was finally made and the emperor realized his error, he drew up the bulk of his army southeast of Leipzig, planning to pin Schwarzenberg and the Allied center while Augereau and IX Corps enveloped the right, Marmont and the others were to hold Blücher at bay in the north. But the Battle of Leipzig, which began at 6:30 on the morning of I-6 October, soon became a murderous slugging match, a bloodbath of pure attrition which reached a peak between 9 and I a.m. On Napoleon's chosen terrain, the Austrian attack was badly coordinated and a well-drilled defense could have annihilated it. Instead, the French defenders fell into confusion, allowing the Austrians to press on, all the while taking dreadful punishment from 700 well-sighted French guns. By mid-morning it was clear that the Allied offensive against the French center had failed. At this crucial moment Napoleon dithered, not wanting to order Augereau's flanking movement until he was certain that Marmont had not been overwhelmed by Blücher. He opted instead for softening up the Austrian center by wheeling up ISO guns and pounding them for an hour. At midday he launched his counterattack in the main sector. Initially this went well, and the prospect of victory loomed. At 2 p.m. he decided to go for the knockout punch, and for half an hour there followed the most vicious fighting any of the French veterans could remember. At 2:30 p.m. Murat and his I cavalry went into action. Thinking all was secure in the center, Napoleon turned his attention to the north. Here Marmont and VI Corps had been involved in fighting that was, if anything, even more sanguinary than the engagement in the southeast. Marmont's captaincy that day was inspired and he almost achieved a miracle like Davout's at Auerstadt against the Prussians. 2 things worked against him. Once again Ney proved the French nemesis by his supreme idiocy. He continually recalled and re-recalled 2 divisions of Sauham's 3 Corps, undecided whether to send them to Marmont, to Lindenau or the Emperor, with the result that the 2 divisions finally got into the battle just half an hour before dusk. The other thing that prevented Marmont's miracle was the refusal by the Württemberg cavalry to charge when ordered. Probably they were already planning the treachery that took place 2 days later. As in all battles, the vital moment came and went. By nightfall the Prussians had counterattacked and were getting the better of the engagement. However, Napoleon cannot escape censure for the failure in the north, as he had not expected heavy fighting there at all. Since there was murderous fighting in both sectors, numbers told, and Napoleon was probably just a corps short of achieving total victory in both parts of the battle. The distraction in the north was probably crucial to French fortunes in the south too, for the emperor was concentrating on Marmont's problems at the precise moment he should have been sending in infantry to support Murat in the coup de grace. His failure to do this allowed Russian cavalry to countercharge, and by 3:30 p.m. the great opportunity had gone. By 4 p.m. the French were making ground steadily but had still not broken the Austrians. Then the arrival of Allied reinforcements allowed the Austrians to counterattack. By nightfall the French were back where they started. When the fateful day of the 16th of October ended, the French had slightly the upper hand in the southeast but slightly the worse of it in the north. Since French losses nearly equaled those of the Allies, the result of the battle could only be considered a draw. But for Napoleon matters could only get worse, since he had no significant reinforcements to draw on, while Bernadotte and Bennigsen were drawing near with an extra 40,000 for the Allies. Grave and rapid decisions needed to be made next day, but Napoleon again spent the day in gloomy indecision. At first he ordered a general retreat to the Rhine, then countermanded this and decided to stay on in Leipzig, apparently hoping that the Allies would score some spectacular own goal. It seems that he could not quite accept that he had come so close to victory only to see it snatched away. This was his most grievous mistake over the 3 days. The Allies were quite content to wait until all their reinforcements had come up. Too late Napoleon's intelligence agents brought word of the scale of the forces opposed to him. Whereas the initial numbers had been 260,000 to 200,000 in the Allies' favor, the figures were now 320,000 and 160,000 respectively. With 6 centripetal attacks planned for the 1/8, it seemed that the Allies were preparing to crack him like a nut. At the 11th hour the emperor finally bestirred himself and ordered more bridges to be built over the river Lindemann in case he needed to retreat. In torrential rain he pulled his men back, conscious that they were now outnumbered 2 to 1. On the morning of the 18th of October the Allies advanced confidently. Once again dreadful fighting took place, particularly in the afternoon, as more and more divisions on both sides were sucked into the conflict. Bennigsen and Bernadotte made significant inroads in the east against MacDonald and Sebastiani, and Napoleon had to order in both young and old guards to prevent this sector collapsing altogether. Just when French fortunes were being restored, 2 brigades of Saxons, and some Württembergers from Rainier's 7 Corps, supposedly Napoleon's precious reinforcements, deserted to the enemy, leaving a gaping hole in the French line. By dusk Bennigsen and Bernadotte had dislodged Marmont and Rainier's corps from their positions, and both in the north and the east the French were being inexorably forced back into the suburbs of Leipzig. With rising casualties and dwindling ammunition, Napoleon now had to accept that Leipzig was untenable. He ordered a phased evacuation, which began at 2 a.m. on the 19th. First out were the cavalry, then followed the infantry units. The Allies did not detect the withdrawal until 7 that morning but were held up by Oudinot's ferocious rearguard action, in which his men fought street by street and house by house until the army crossed the Elster River causeway to Lindenau. By 11 a.m. when Napoleon himself crossed over, all seemed to be working out well. All that now remained, once Oudinot's men had retired across the bridge, was to blow up the causeway, preventing Allied pursuit to Lindenau. Now came utter disaster. In a classic of buck passing, the general assigned to the actual demolition delegated the setting of charges to a Colonel Montfort. This worthy in turn decamped when the street fighting came uncomfortably close, and left the final job of demolition to a corporal. Unaware of the carefully scheduled timetable, the corporal ignited the fuses at 1 p.m. when the bridge was still crowded with French troops and Oudinot's rearguard was still in the city. The explosion and subsequent panic en route led to the deaths of thousands of French troops and the capture of thousands more. Oudinot's heroes held out until late afternoon before surrendering, and Oudinot himself escaped by swimming the swollen Elster. Others were not so lucky, and among the celebrity prisoners were Rainier and Lauriston. The saddest fate befell the newest marshal, Prince Poniatowski, the Pole, who had been rewarded with a marshal's baton for his conspicuous gallantry the day before, enjoyed his rank less than 24 hours. As he spurred his steed across the engorged Elster, the horse lost its footing on the river bed, toppled over and pitched its master into the flood waters, where he drowned. Leipzig was a catastrophe for Napoleon second only to 1812. Over 4 days he had lost 38,000 casualties and a further 30,000 taken prisoner as a result of the fiasco at the Elster Bridge. In addition he had abandoned 325 cannon and been deserted by 5,000 Saxons. The Allies could make good their horrendous 54,000 casualty roll over the same period, but the French could not. Altogether, in the 1813 campaign, Napoleon had lost a further 400,000 men on top of the massive casualties in Russia in 1812, including 100,000 men in the scattered garrisons from Danzig to Dresden who were gradually forced to surrender, many of them by dishonest Allied promises which the victors later refused to ratify. The Confederacy of the Rhine was stone dead, as Bavaria and Saxony now made common cause with the Allies. The demoralized French army arrived at Erfurt like a pack of beaten curs and tatterdemalion beggars. Gloomily they retreated through Frankfurt and Mayence. But even at this stage the army had teeth, as the incautious General Reid, with a force of Bavarians and Austrians, learned to his cost in an utter defeat at Hanau on the 30th of October, remaining at a respectful distance and hampered, like their opponents, by heavy rain and a typhus epidemic. The Allies took until Christmas to reach the east bank of the Rhine. By that time the prize for first to invade France had already gone to Wellington, who trod French soil for the first time on the 7th of October. The reasons for Napoleon's failure in 1813 were several. The poor caliber of his men, the lackluster performance of the Marshallate, the dwindling enthusiasm at all levels in the French army, all these played a part. Napoleon's performance as a captain was indifferent. He started well at Bautzen and Lützen but seemed to have run out of ideas by Leipzig, especially as it became clear that the enemy had learned their lessons well and were alive to all his tricks. Above all, though, the two things that sank Napoleon were the lack of horses, preventing him from campaigning properly, and the sheer volume of numbers on the Allied side. In all his career as a gambler the emperor had never before had to confront the combined might of Russia, Austria and Prussia. In his heart he knew his chances were forlorn after August 1813, and hence the many interludes of almost catatonic depression. But now he needed to reach down into the bag in which he stored all his guile and experience, for by the end of 1813 his very survival was at stake.